right, everybody. So this is the long-awaited conversation. Uncle Dave wanted to have this podcast a long time ago, and we had to actually first have many discussions in High Noon to get on the same page, because it seems like purity is a very broad topic that is interpreted in an infinite different way, in infinite different ways by different people based on your experience and your perspective. So we wanted to unpack it for our own sake and for your sake, because it's such an important topic that I think impacts us all, whether you are single or whether you're in a couple, whether you're 120 years old, this actually impacts you. So with me, I have an all-star cast. This is not usual. Benji is not here. He's tapped out. We have Sammy here, who looks like he's got gun holsters on. Welcome, Sammy, back to the podcast.
Hello. Great to be back. It's been quite a long time.
Long-time listener, first-time caller. Welcome, Sammy. And we have Uncle David W. Wolfenberger. I don't even know what is your middle name?
My middle name is Lee. David Lee.
Korean.
We have a David Lee already in High Noon, so I don't use that.
Okay. Well, welcome back to your podcast that you own. And last time, as a High Noon person, and before she transitions to BFM, we have Karina Martinez, Cunningman. Hey. Welcome, Cunningham.
Let the lady speak, will ya?
I'm glad that you only have 1 hour. Thank you so much, everyone. Here I am, very excited to talk about this.
Sweet. Welcome. So we are set up, and we're just going to go broad at first, and then we'll chisel away at this topic. And the first item on the agenda is, what is purity? And I'm just going to shut up, and whoever wants to talk, because we're going to, let's have a juicy conversation. Don't hold back. Uncle Dave, you look the most eager to talk. You have this smirk on your face. Yeah, got to say something.
Well, I think in the past, the general consensus of people in our church, especially First Gen, is that purity is like not having sex before marriage, and losing your purity is having sex before marriage. And I don't think that's very productive. I don't think that's productive, because if purity is if you collapse that with having sex, then there's no way to restore one's purity after it's been lost, because you can't undo a sexual relationship. So I believe that purity is a state of mind and heart and commitment to giving ourselves fully, to being committed to our spouse or our future spouse. And it's something that we temporarily lose when we have sex before marriage, or when we, to different degrees, if we engage in oral sex or even pornography, you lose some level of purity.
Okay, great. So we got Uncle Dave's perspective on that. Does anybody want to contest or debate? Yes, Sammy.
Oh,
Go for it.
Wholeheartedly endorse. I don't know. Does it need to be a debate person next?
No.
I love what Uncle David said. I think that purity, talking about what is purity first, what I think it's not is this emphasis on like a checklist of activities, which for decades was how it was educated. And that, you do that, you don't, mostly not even a clear list of things to do, mostly don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And then you have this holy grail status of being called pure. And I think even within that definition, it's clearly flaws when you think about and talk about it, right? Like that, the idea of like penetrative sex and engaging in kind of sexual relationship, as that is the line, black and white, of purity status in most cases. But there's such a spectrum within the realm of sexuality and sexual activity that very much maybe differently on a spiritual level, but very much on an emotional and physical level, it affects you a lot and affects your future relationships, affects your life. Oral sex is one thing Uncle David mentioned. A lot of people, I don't want to say a lot, but people have experiences with homosexual activity, right? Which would by the
Textbook.
the textbook, the Judaic letter of the law would mean that they maintain their unfallen status, but still has a huge impact, all these different activities.
Yeah.
And so it's more than that, right? Because it's not that that talking about those things is unimportant. They are very important, which I think we'll talk about here. We'll get into how, why even sexually, right? This, like, abstaining from sexual behavior for a period of your life or until you're in a relationship with someone is really important. But it does go beyond that, which is kind of chewing on it and thinking about for a long time, many years, and talking about amongst us, that I think we've all come to recognize is really important. I could keep talking, but I'll pause and let someone else go.
Well, Karina's got something in the pipe. I can see it.
Yeah, so thank you, Sammy, Uncle David. I just want to bring up as well, like, where the emphasis on purity comes from and where maybe got confused a little bit, right? So Christianity, there are Christians. Christianity is the first group actually emphasizing purity, and that's because there are a couple versicles in the Bible that says kept talking about purity, and then different versicles in the Bible that says that you should not have sex before marriage, right? It's really honorable to see that a lot of Christians have kept their sexual virginity because of a couple of versicles in the Bible. Like, there's not so much explanation in the Bible of why purity or why not having sex before marriage is important. But for those strong Christians, those versicles in the Bibles are enough to actually create and hold their standards, right? So that's first for Christianity. But then we, through true parents and then the divine principle, we learn that sex has such a big impact in our lives, right? And that sex is the origin of the universe, and therefore as well was the origin of the fallen world, right? Through the fall. And it was sex that brings God's lineage and God's ideal for creation, right? So it really has a big impact on sex. And therefore, the emphasis on purity in a way is kind of like explaining why sex is so important, right? And what are the consequences of playing and doing things with sex on the wrong time with the wrong person outside the blessing, right? And I think the problem is when we start to think about, we lost why it's important, right? Why sex is important, and we focus on, okay, what are the nitty-gritties of purity, right? And when we start to say, oh, if I do this, I don't lose my purity, I don't lose my standard, I don't lose. And yes, there are certain limits that we had to put on, and there are certain limits like touching the sexual organs and having intercourse will mean change of lineage, right? It will mean some impact, and big impact in a person's life. But then if we only focus on that, and we only focus on, okay, purity on terms of like what I can do, instead of like what is the impact of sex in my life and what I want for my life, then that's where things get kind of confusing. And as well, if we only focus on that, then we don't really helping people who did mistakes to really restore themselves, right? So I think at the end of the day, we always want to come back to the vision of why purity is important, connected with the purpose of purity, which is to actually teach humanity the importance of sex, right?
So not to get lost in the details, but also to remember the reason why this is important. Yeah, it's a good point. And so, well, in terms of purity, like, it's clearly a broad topic. And what I'm hearing from Uncle Dave is that, we shouldn't, and also Sammy, like, there's kind of legalistic stuff to consider, but it's more than that. And I'm getting that from you, Karina. Like, purity is both the small and the big, but I would say that as a faith community, it's very easy to focus on somewhere in between. If you really look at it, because the details aren't very clear in our movements, right? Like, what is actual purity from like an intellectual standpoint? Like, is my mind pure if I watch porn? Is that okay? So these kind of questions haven't been ironed out, but also the clear reason why purity is important, and the kind of vision aspect also isn't clear. So it seems like most people are kind of focused in the middle. Would you guys agree on that? That whatever discussions about purity, it's not necessarily about the vision of sexuality, and it's not necessarily about the detail. It's more like these broad skeletal structures of purity is abstinence, like you're saying, Uncle David, abstinence before marriage and fidelity in marriage. That's most people's typical understanding. Would you agree or disagree? Anybody?
Yeah, I would say that purity is very much connected to vision. Purity is more internal. It's the heart and the soul, and it's about the future. What you've done in the past that, well, like having had sex before marriage, that has to do with the physical body, with the past. And it's something that, it's a thing, whereas purity is, purity is a vision, I would say. A vision for how I want to use my physical body, my sexual organ.
I'll add to that. But add to it and backtrack a little bit, right? 2 in 1. So, believing in a God of grace and redemption, and believing in the principle of restoration, then to me it just makes sense that something like purity, it needs to be something that is regainable through restoration, through repentance, or through grace. And sexual status, virginity, is not, obviously, right? And so to me, it's just like one and A and B, right? So then that's the beginning process of starting with that. Okay, so what is something that is regainable, that you can be restored to? And what kind of purity would that be? And to me, that's like lining up. So there's the backtrack and then adding on. So that makes sense with what Uncle David's saying about, it's something like a quality of your mind, right? And it's a way you relate with people and relate with yourself, and you relate with the world in your life. And it's something that drives you into your future. And it's something that, it dictates how you live your life, how you relate with people.
Sure.
And it's something that it affects the decisions that you make. So those kind of things. And in other ways, like when I think the classic example of what is something, who's someone that looks pure, who is pure? It's children. People always think about children. They're the epitome of purity. And no one thinks about their sexual status when they're looking at children. It's like, oh, they're pure because they haven't had sex. That's not what people think about, hopefully. It's something about like the way they relate with the world around them. They relate with their parents. They relate with other children, with people. There's the purity to their heart, pure-heartedness that they have. And I think that's touching in that direction also, what purity really is.
So I would love full disclosure to talk about, there was contention when this topic came up. And I think it's worth discussing that one thing that, Sammy, you brought up in your blog that you wrote. You wrote an article really defining purity, and it was really helpful because it was the first stab at us really getting clear on what this thing is. You mentioned that in the 90s, there's a lot of education about purity, and it was really educated. The education was along the lines that it's something that you need to maintain and keep. And if you are to desecrate this holy thing, then it's basically like you're used forever. And that ultimately had some negative repercussions. But then Uncle Dave, what I understood from you, and you can clarify if I'm wrong, was that you just wanted to make sure that people understood that there are repercussions for losing your virginity, that yes, purity is a state of mind, like was just mentioned from two of you, but there's also a sexual purity that is very real, that is, say, lost through the engagement of sex prematurely, right? And so I just kind of wanted to unpack that a little bit, because this is a very practical aspect that I think we can all agree that purity is a state of being, and we can unpack that. I would love to unpack that. But there's also the physical reality of that can be used as a justification by immature people to maybe try and experiment a little bit and say, well, I can get back to that state of being later. I just want to kind of go to this dark place. So I just wanted to kind of open up that conversation, because it was something that prompted some serious debate within High Noon. And I think we resolved it. I think we're friends again, right? But it was like I don't think it was just a couple of people's opinions. I think this is in the lore about what is purity, and a contention that, people experience from either side. So.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. There is a high level of contention. Sammy and I, we almost went at it. It was fortunate.
I ordered a pair of boxing gloves on Amazon, and I was ready.
Yeah, and it all got started with that blog that Sammy wrote that never got published. That nobody ever saw.
I think this is a great segue into this, because, this is I think this is a huge crux of it, right? Like, what I've seen as the flaw of purity education in the past is, and so we're entering that wanting to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Is that there's really important things to this topic, but then voicing the flaws that were with that form of education. And for me, it comes down to truth, right? And it's really important to educate the truth of the effects that actions have on us. So the truth of what are the actual effects of engaging in sex or any kind of sexual activity. And because there are, so just getting clear and helping people see clearly what those are. But because that's not how I was educated about in the past. I was educated very much in the way that your identity and your value as a human being is tied to this. And if you make any kind of mistake in this area, and these are things that people were told by very authoritative figures, right? Like, you'll get a special box in hell that you'll never be able to come out of, and you'll lose your status as a second gen, et cetera, et cetera. Things that are not true. They're lies, right? And so, I think it's important to talk about, but so people know truthfully, because it can backfire, right? It either makes people just very afraid of this area, or they recognize how untrue it is, and they can push back against it. And then so you get those people like, well, screw purity, it's all fake to begin with. And then they lose sight of the real effects and the real things that are lost when you have purity, because it's really crucial to a thriving marriage, is that there's this way that you relate with your spouse, and then the way that you very actively not relate with other people, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember one time I was at a high school camp, and a first gen was giving a talk on purity, and there's a whole group of high schoolers there, and he told them that as of now, there's no way for a second gen who has lost their purity to be restored. And it was, I was so angry, there were many sisters in the group that were crying. Not many, but there were a few. And afterwards, I asked like a group of first gen. I said, maybe we don't know specifically what the mechanism for restoration is, but we all know that God is a God of love, and He will never let His children just rot in hell. True parents want everybody to go to the blessing. And you know what the answer was? They said, yeah, we know that, but if we tell them there's a way back, then they'll want to fall. They'll want to experiment with it.
Yeah. Well, it's not, I feel like it's an irresponsible way of acting on a very sincere emotion, right? Because when you give people the opportunity to make mistakes, rather than keeping them confined in some prison cell, it's so scary, right? So if you do say that there is a way to redeem yourself if you make mistakes, then you're offering them the opportunity to make mistakes. And it creates the opportunity for a lot of pain and suffering that you don't want them to experience, and you don't want to experience as somebody who loves them. And so I understand where that comes from, this kind of like restricting, kind of fearful energy of like, just don't think about that stuff. Just stay, like, don't make mistakes. It's a very clear parental energy that I think comes from a sincere place, but it's also, it lacks trust, and it lacks also a vision of what purity ultimately is, which is it has to be your choice. Because purity isn't purity because you're not doing stuff. Purity is purity because you're willingly giving something to somebody else. So to have a pure heart is like to want to give something to somebody else. That's giving with a pure heart. And if you do it because you feel like you have no other option, that's not love. That's just like servant of servant positions, right? It's just like you're doing everything out of force or fear or some negative emotion. But to the credit, I hear this stuff and it sounds like a horror story when I hear about tales of old workshops come by where people are told that they'll go to hell and there's no redemption if they make this mistake. Like, that is crazy. And it's the opposite of love. But the origin of it, I believe, comes from a place of love, of loving these kids and wanting them to not go through all the hell that probably the person giving the talk has been through, but is not a good approach. I don't think it helps. Karina, I remember you were talking about this stuff too, growing up, this certain way of educating and your own story and your own redemptive kind of story, right? So as somebody who kind of lived through it, do you have something to say?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think I experienced the both sides. From one area, I remember something that it was mentioned a lot during my time. It was the Choniguk standard. And the Choniguk standard was that you never hug opposite sex with a second intention, or like it has to have no hugs, no kiss, no touch of any way. And then if you avoid those, you can have your Choniguk standard. So the Choniguk standard was like the thing to achieve. And then if you lose your Choniguk standard, was your lineage, your sexual purity in a way, right? So that was like the next kind of line. And I remember I crossed a line hugging a guy, and then I was like, okay, I lost my Choniguk standard. I guess I can keep going until the next line because either way I already lost it, right? So that's how it was. I experienced, right? Okay, I lost my Choniguk standard, and then it was something that like a standard that you lose once and that's it, right? And you don't kind of like, once you cross that line, why, like, there's no way back. So may as well just enjoy wherever you are, right? Or like just do whatever you are there. But at the same time, I do remember that knowing that having sex intercourse was the line that it wasn't able to cross back, and it was the point where I could lose I was told that I will lose my status as second generation and I cannot receive the blessing. I knowing that it kind of stopped me to cross the line. I will not say in the most healthy way. I will not say in the most, how to say, hopeful way, but it did. And then when I matured and I was able to understand what purity was and why it was important, then I was grateful for kind of like that education to not cross the line, right? Now I understand that it is tricky, right? So I even myself not sure how to educate about this, right? Because the truth is losing your lineage is as big as the fall for humankind, right? So it is not something to take as small, but for one sexual experience, your life should not be ruined, and there is redemption if you feel it, right? And if you want it, and you're so it is it I honestly did mistakes. I didn't, as I say, I couldn't cross that line, but I did sexual mistakes, big sexual mistakes, right? And at the end of the day, I was able to mature a lot through them. And I don't know, it's really, really hard to say what is the limit, right? I don't want my daughter to make mistakes because they were painful and they had their consequences. But at the same time, those made me who I am and what I strive for and how I live my life. So in a way, I'm grateful for them. So yeah, I don't know.
I'd like to say something about this topic of mistakes. And it's tying to Uncle Andrew. Something what you're saying is still stuck in my mind about how you feel how those people's motivations was coming from a certain place, about why people educated so fearfully is that they wanted, because they didn't want young people to make mistakes. That's they're tied. I'm bringing it up, and it comes from a place of love. And I believe differently. Actually, I don't think it comes from a place of love, and because it's fearful, right? They're afraid of what will happen if young people make those kind of mistakes. And the Bible quote, like our buddy John, right? He said, it comes to my mind often. He said that there is no fear in love. So I mean, to me, that's just really clear and simple, is that they can't coincide in the same way. So when you're motivated by fear, it's actually not love, even though, and I agree though, that there is some sincerity and desire and there's goodness in that motivation, but it's motivated by other things rather than genuine care for this single person's life and their future. Because I think you do things differently, right? You take a more longer viewpoint about how can I prepare this person for the living in the world and being on their own, not so much just how can I help this person avoid as many mistakes as possible until they reach this finish line called the blessing. And so tied to that about mistakes, right? Because like this fear of mistakes, what's helped me, I got kids, right? So I understand very well also. And I for the past several years, my whole career working high noon have been mentoring and taking care of people, right? So this being very vested in other people's lives, right? That dynamic. And what's helped me like take a longer viewpoint and be a better mentor, be a better parent for all these people is the understanding that part of living life is naturally to make mistakes, because here in life we learn. We're here to learn things. We're here to grow. And that's just a part of that process. When we're learning how to drive, we're learning how to ride a bicycle, when we're learning how to make loving relationships with people. And, we can teach people and teach our children, and they don't have to make every kind of mistake, but they're going to make some kind of mistake. they're going to, amongst siblings, one of them, if there's multiple siblings, one of them's going to be a bully. I don't know any family that didn't have a bully in the family, amongst the siblings. And, it's very hurtful to the others. Or they'll bully other people, or I don't know, in some way they'll hurt somebody, or they'll steal, or there's something, right? They make mistakes. And so not necessarily sexually, and it could be sexually, but it's part of life, and they are painful. And it's like, yeah, I totally get it, the desire for people to avoid pain. But when I think about my children, right, and what my end goal is for them, it's for them not to live the rest of their life under my protection as my child. It's for them to go out in the world as their own independent person and to live their life. And so that's what I want to prepare them for. And even though it's painful, those are the things that help them. Like Karina said, those are experiences that help shape you who you are. I didn't need, you didn't need those experiences. You would have shaped in some other equally incredible way if you had different experiences. Right? But those are the experiences you had, those are the mistakes you made, that's the pain that you felt. And so that's what made you become who you are now. And like, I view pain as like really from the perspective of a life, especially from the perspective of eternity. It's like the equivalent of like when I see my child fall and scrape their knee, right, I feel sad and okay, make sure they're okay. But I don't anguish over the direction of their destiny, because until you recognize the scope of that incident, it's painful for minutes, maybe a couple days, and then they'll go on with their life. And I think from the perspective of eternity, and even just the perspective of a lifetime, a lot of the mistakes, the pain that we experience from mistakes, it fits into that. It's painful for a time period, but then it helps us grow and helps us learn. And when we go on with our life.
I think from a healer's perspective, that's the long view that we would want to adopt and attest to as being the healthiest. I just feel imagine that's you with a few kids, but imagine you had 50,000 kids. Let's say you're a busy guy, right? But like on that's kind of what our movement is, like how to mitigate as much pain and suffering as possible. I think, religions tend to gravitate towards fear because it's a very deep emotional motivator. And I'm not justifying it or saying, but it's a lot harder, especially given the corrupt nature of our culture, to motivate people by a sense of vision. Because we even, that's our business in High Noon, is to help inspire vision within people. And we can see how much individual resistance there is to that. And that usually when people come to us, it's not because they're inspired by our vision, but it's because they're stuck and they're motivated by, I don't want to be stuck anymore, which is more like fear of being stuck forever. So I agree with you from like that would be an ideal, place to come from like parent to child. But organizationally, I don't want to justify, but I do believe that kind of made sense during the chaos of our movement from the 70s up until very recently, is that people didn't have the bandwidth to speak from a place of like calm, vision, love. It's okay if you make mistakes, because that's like, it's more like, just can we stop, just stop. Can we have something that's stable for once? And so I wanted to segue that, like, what you're talking about is the starting of a conversation about Purity 1.0 versus Purity 2.0. And I'd love to unpack those, because whenever I give those talks, I remember in the early days of giving the talk of Purity 2.0, I didn't lift up Purity 1.0. And Uncle Dave, I remember you giving me that note of like, don't have the tone that Purity 1.0 is bad, because it is good, but it's only half the story. Purity 2.0 is much more like the completion. So I wanted to kind of unpack, because there were mistakes that were made in Purity 1.0, right? But I think it was an ignorance rather than like an intentional, vindictive, let's make people suffer. So does anybody want to unpack that, or like lead that conversation about what is the difference between Purity 1? What are the key differences between what was and what is becoming?
When we were in Europe, after we gave the talk about Purity 2.0, one of the, yes, actually, he said, David, that's great. It's what we need. And you need to acknowledge the second gen that are here and the first two who kept their purity, and not just, anyway, you need to acknowledge the people who went the primary course, if you would, and at the same time to emphasize forgiveness for the people who went a different course. One thing that I did change something after we started having this discussion. When we first started the discussion about somebody who had a sexual relation before marriage and then restored their purity, they could be complete, but they would have regret. Like they would regret that they could never give their first love to their spouse, and that would always be with them. When I thought about that and I prayed about it, I remember in the principle it says that a restoration is to be restored completely to the same level as you were before the fall. So restoring something that is lost its position is to completely restore that position as if it hadn't happened. And so I realized that regret, it would not always stay with the person. That remorse would not always stay with the person. And, maybe through their experience, of course, there's going to be a lot of pain and a lot of suffering that they'll have to go through. And through that experience, there's going to be somebody down the road that they can help out. They can be qualified in a way that another person couldn't be qualified. Oh, I think that's one way that I changed my belief about purity.
I'm just I just want to be sensitive or mindful that I don't talk too much, that's all. But I think I could always add something if need be. We haven't discussed what are the negative consequences. So I think that might be a helpful place to list, because we're saying, oh, there are, but it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. And yes, you can still be happy and have a good relationship and don't have to live shame-filled for the rest of your life. It really, so I can share the perspective I can share. It's maybe not that perspective is, me and my wife, we were matched and by a true father and blessed. So we went, I didn't even know it was called at the time. It's the Chunaluk matching. And there's this Chunaluk standard, right? And they have very strict qualifications of, relationship history and sexual history. So my wife and I, we both fit that criteria, so we were able to go. I didn't have any kind of relationship. And I don't think that hugging was on that official one, though, because I had hugged women prior. And so what I can say as the benefits of having that background, that's what I can share about, is it's immensely helpful to not have the imagery, for one, and the history of, and the comparisons and the subconscious expectations or concepts of what relationship is supposed to look like or meant to look like. And we were really we had some stuff, right, from other places, but by and large, way more than most people, starting from a blank slate, both of us. That was really helpful, especially because what I learned going to a relationship was, wow, this is hard. It's a lot of work. And I thought in the beginning, I thought about it so many times, like, man, I'm like scrambling to figure out how to do this right. given where we're starting. I mean, if we were starting farther back, I have no idea how we'd handle it. And so you start farther back, what we can say is that you just got more to clean up, more to work through, more to heal. And that can become, it can come to the point where like trying to work on that and be in a relationship and work in a relationship, it's could be unrecoverable. It's just really hard. And more hard than maybe what some people are capable of. And so they don't invest in the relation, like they don't do either one fully or successfully. And so they just scramble by. That's to say that there are people that do, and they have the thriving, wonderful marriages that we all hope for. I know many couples, different situations, both had a sexual relationship, both fell, they made relationship work. Only one of them fell or had any kind of sexual history, and the other had not, and they made a relationship work. So it is the starting point, right? And the starting point of the rest of your life partner. And so in the long run, like where you end up is infinitely more important than where you start. But in the beginning, like where you're starting from, it's very relevant because it's what you're experiencing. And it becomes harder, right? And to varying degrees of restorability, let's say, like all restorable, not to say that, but some, even so, coming from the background of like having watched porn prior, that was never officially part of the Chanukuk standard. They neglected.
You lucked out
there,
there, Sammy.
right? Huh?
You lucked out.
Yeah. Gosh, yeah. And so that, but I mean, even unofficially, it was not a requirement anyway, but just my conscious, like my original mind wanted this not to be part of my relationship. So even before I went to the matching blessing years prior, it was something I was working on and I was completely clean from. And it's still something that affected my relationship with my wife, especially in the area of sex, is that I had a lot of unconscious concepts about how sex gets initiated, how sex progresses, and even just images that came into my mind that with time did fade away, and with practice and education experience corrected all the misconceptions I had. But it didn't help, it harmed the beginnings, and it's just, so it's like, but then we were able to work it out. And so perspective from what I experienced.
Yeah, thank you, Sammy. I think coming back to your question, Andrew, about Purity 1.0 and then Purity 2.0, is that, as Sammy is saying, there's more clear reasons why purity is important, from its consequences, but as well for its value, right? Both sides. And I would love to get to the point where we talk about purity and people wants to keep their purity, not out of fear, but out of the value that it will bring in their life, right? And how beautiful their lives can be. And for those who lost it, that they can go back to that and they want that, right, back, because they understand why it's important in their lives, right? So I think Purity 1.0 was focused on fear, focus on, if you do, this is the line, focus on the line and the details, right, of what you can cross, what you cannot, and then saying that there are big consequences, but not really clear what are the consequences, not really clear about why the blessing is a blessing, right? Like why it is so valuable. And just coming out from a place that don't talk about the bad things, right? Don't talk about porn, don't talk about relationship, don't talk about it, because you open a door that other people will like to join, right? And I think we can do better, right? And we hope that the next level of purity is a place where we can acknowledge the bad, we can acknowledge the mistakes, we can acknowledge what we can learn from it, and as well we can acknowledge the purity, and we can acknowledge how the blessing of keeping the purity and how wonderful it is and why it will be so good for the couple, right? And for people to decide to keep their purity from a place of, oh, wow, I want that. And that's the struggle that our generation faced. It was that it was preached to say, keep your purity, but because with the promise of love, but we couldn't see that end result. We couldn't see how that bring good results because we couldn't see loving couples. We couldn't see happy families. So in a way, that really make the whole thing not very clear, right? Very theoretical. But if we can show happy couples, show happy families, show the value of purity, and explain why is it worthy, then I think more people will choose for it, right? And then it will be a actually commitment and not like something that and you do because your parents push you for.
Yeah.
Yes. Inspiring. Can I tell her this?
No. Stop talking. Just kidding.
I think that purity is essential to be happy. It's like it is an important and necessary part of life. Now, when I think of opposite of purity, the words that come to mind are bitter, jaded, cynical, angry. Qualities that like a person, it doesn't contribute to a person's fulfillment in life or peace. And so purity is this, it's something, I think it's really important as something you grow and nurture and that you do have.
Yeah. I think the word has been associated with a whole bunch of mess as well, because usually dictators use this. You see this a lot in principle, that the dark side does something first before the good people, and they kind of tarnish it. So like purity was the main emphasis for the Nazi party, right? Is pure lineage. And like this idea of we have lineage and we have pure lineage too. It's kind of creepy how close it is, except it's a completely different emphasis. And so, I mean, going off of Sammy's, like it's beautiful. The whole thing about that, because I just gave this talk actually online a couple of days ago, and I could really see that Purity 1.0 is really about all the stuff to avoid. And it's super helpful as a foundation, but it doesn't mean that you're a good communicator or a nice person or a kind person, a good listener or anything good. It just means that you didn't do a bunch of bad stuff on this list. You could be a Unabomber. You could be a psychopath and not kiss people and not do all these things, but it doesn't. And we saw that. Honestly speaking, we've seen that in the blessing, that somebody passes this criteria of not doing these certain things, but they are not stable mentally. They're not healthy spiritually. There's like all the sorts of these people have kind of somehow leaked their way into the blessing and have wreaked havoc in some people's lives. And it's really sad. And so I think we can avoid that by redefining purity, like you said, Uncle Dave, in the beginning, which is a state of being, which is a pure mindedness, a pure heartedness, a pure spirit, nature. And that culminates in pure actions, meaning loving and giving. And the priority is on harmony, creating harmony. And so when that becomes the kind of goal, the standard, then it becomes much more visible whether each thought is taking you closer to that state or not. And it's more helpful for the individual, but it's also as a collective, you can see, and Sammy, you brought this up a little bit too, that then the goal isn't to stay pure until your blessing, and then there's no education after that, by the way. It's to maintain a life of purity and a pure family that has really good intentions and treats each other purely. Like I treat my wife with a pure heart. I treat my kids with a pure heart. If that's the gold standard, that's what you're saying, Karina, is very inspiring, because you see the results of hanging out with a family like that. To me, I see that a lot in the Portalons family. Shout out to the Portalons. Is how they talk to each other is so inspiring. My wife and I have always kind of felt like that's the gold standard of like when they hang out together, it's so inspiring. Like so many people have tried to engraft themselves into the Port Orange family because it just feels nice being around them. So to have that, I think is, again, there's no end date to that. That's just the state that you would want to live in. If it's that, or like what Samuel was talking about, being jaded and embittered and resentful and all this stuff, which is the way that the world is, which is you don't have pure intentions. You're very willing to do whatever it takes to make money or to get ahead in life or to take what you need from people. That's the antithesis of purity. Purity wants to give, like you said, Sammy, as a child, just kind of looks out into the world and says, hey, what can I create today? And it's very, beautiful and wants everybody to win, kind of. So I think that in terms of like a state, we could probably spend a lot more time defining that and illustrating that and exemplifying that, so that doesn't become the standard that everybody compares themselves to, but it just becomes a more etched out vision of what life could be like if we just lived a certain way. It's not like, am I doing it or not? It's more like, oh, I can see I'm veering off from the standard that I'm hoping to achieve.
You're throwing around that, and I think that our church has been looking for a subjective standard that they can gauge purity by, and they've come up with a definition of like any part of the penis touching any part of the vagina, sexual abuse, rape. If somebody is raped, then the standard of the church says that they've lost their purity. And I think they've been looking for a subjective standard. I read one reflection from our High Noon tour in the Philippines where she's grateful that she only had lesbian relationships because she could keep her purity. And yeah, so Karina, you've got your hands full. You're gonna be the new head of the BFD. This will be to redefine purity. What are you gonna do?
Yeah, well, it's time we start wrapping things up. So any last reflections would be helpful. Why is this worth discussing? Let's start there. Why should people care about this topic? Why is it important?
Okay, well, I think it's really important because some people have taken issue with High Noon. When we go to talk with young people and we hear these questions, like they'll have anonymous Q&A, and so many times we'll get questions like, I've fallen, is there any hope for me to still get the blessing? And we tell them, yes, absolutely, there's hope. You can restore a mistake. And some people, they take issue with this, and they say that if you tell people that, then they're just going to want to try it out because they know they can always come back. And that leads to a very judgmental church, self-righteous. And it's not the kind of church that most second gen or even first gen want to be a part of. It's not what I signed up for when I joined this church.
Thank you. Yeah, very true. Sammy, Karina?
I think it's important to talk about this because we want to be happy, right? And we mentioned before about how purity has its impact in our happiness and in our life overall. Yeah, if we have a mind full of dirty stuff and ugly stuff, right? We will not be able to find joy and happiness in our lives. So it really is part of our key aspects of our lives for our happiness and love, right? So not only based on like our experience, but as well how we see the world and what is our understanding of love and the use of sex, right? So usually people who have sex once and then they feel like their purity has lost forever, they will not stop there. They will continue having sexual relationships. And that's where they become unhappy, because that's where they lose themselves in the experience of sex with different people, right? And that's where the problems start to get bigger. So I believe it's important to talk about this because it has its real consequences, but at the same time, purity by itself is something wonderful that we should want to achieve, no matter if we had a sexual relationship or not in our past.
Thank you, Karina.
Ditto. Just ditto. It's important. I think doubly so because it's actually important and so misunderstood. So it's two sides to an important reason why, or a reason why it's important to talk about. On one side, it's naive to assume that you can enter a fulfilling relationship without any preparation, and that you can live immaturely, self-centeredly, hedonistically, and then naturally transition into being a selfless, caring spouse. And then on the other side, making mistakes doesn't end the possibility of happiness for you. Is that there's an end direction that we can always pursue. There's a vision and ideal that we can work towards, and where we're starting from, it changed person to person and stage in our life, but it's just a starting point.
Yeah, and I would say the potential to give my sexuality exclusively to my spouse is really important, because the difference between absolute sex and free sex is the conjugal love loses its potential for perfection the moment it's divided. That's the definition that Father gave one time. And it does set the precedent for that conjugal love to be divided.
Yeah, thank you. I think, what we're talking about here is that there is an impact when we do stop. There's an impact on us and on other people and the world and our future, and the past is all connected. It's this being that we're participating in, and that's something that if you've made mistakes in the past, you got to get real with, and you got to heal that stuff, and that is possible. And it's always, redemption is always a possibility. That was the story of Jesus. That was the whole purpose of him. And so we're meant to be a step beyond that, right? Which is fully redempting our souls. And so if you can understand that, then the hope is to avoid impacting the world negatively and impacting yourself and your future negatively, and instead creating a vision where you're really participating in the fullness of love and life. And in so doing, you will be avoiding those mistakes. So thank you all for listening. We are going to wrap it up here. This is a topic that we really recommend you have conversations about in your homes and with us and wherever you are, because we've been wrestling with this quite a bit over the years, and it only really seeps in after you've talked about your concepts and your fears and your doubts and your hopes and your dreams and all that. And that's the high noon way. So please reach out if you have any questions. Please talk to your friends and family about this stuff. It's really, really important. And the more mainstream we can get with these kind of conversations, the faster we can all get to a workable, livable culture of purity. So thank you all, and I'll see you next week. Peace. Say bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Next time.